Julian Kane was a billionaire widower who lived behind a fortress of glass and grief, a man so guarded that even his own employees feared to look him in the eye. To the world, he was untouchable; to himself, he was already a ghost. Then one night, as a corporate storm threatened to tear his empire apart, he heard a strange, rhythmic thudding coming from beneath his massive mahogany desk. When he pushed back his chair, expecting a threat to his security, he found something impossible: a toddler sitting among the biometric wires, looking up at him with a smile so familiar it nearly stopped Julian's heart. In that single moment, the walls Julian had built around his life for 5 years collapsed. Somehow, this small, innocent intruder had breached the most advanced security system in the city, arriving exactly when Julian's world was unraveling. But was it really just a coincidence, or was it a message from the life he thought he'd lost? Before we uncover how this tiny stranger changed everything, this is Life Tale Stories, where even the coldest hearts can be thawed by the most unexpected encounters. If you want to see what happens when a man who fears everyone meets the one soul he can't push away, subscribe, turn on notifications, and settle in. Julian Kane closed the heavy office door, his mind racing with the latest betrayal from his board of directors. He didn't need to check his phone to know the news was grim. The hostile takeover of Kane International had begun 3 hours ago. It was a slow, nauseating collapse, with every loyal partner suddenly turning into a predator. As he sank into his chair and whispered his late wife's name into the empty room, he heard it, a soft, bubbly coo. His eyes snapped open. The sound hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from right under his feet. The silence in the penthouse was a physical weight, heavier than the gold and marble that adorned it. Julian stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the city pulse with a life he no longer felt a part of. Today was the 5th anniversary of Elena's passing, a day that always felt like walking through a freezing fog. He traced the rim of his crystal glass, his reflection a sharp-edged silhouette against the twilight. To the world, he was the titan of Kane International, but in this room, he was simply a man standing in the wreckage of a life that had once been filled with laughter and the scent of jasmine. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, a jarring intrusion into his morning. He didn't have to look to know the contents. His chief of staff had warned him that the board was meeting in a private session, one he hadn't been invited to. The widower's wall, as the tabloids cruelly called his isolation, had finally become a target. His directors, men he had enriched beyond their wildest dreams, now saw his grief as a liability. They whispered that he was unfocused, drifting, and paralyzed by the past. They wanted a leader who was all steel and no soul, unaware that Julian's ruthlessness was the only thing keeping his heart from shattering completely. He turned toward his desk, his gaze falling on a framed photo of Elena. Her smile was the only light in his darkening world. "They're coming for us, Elena," he murmured, his voice a dry rasp in the empty office. "They think I've forgotten how to fight." He felt the old instinct rise, the cold, defensive posture his father had instilled in him, a belief that vulnerability was a precursor to defeat. He began to pull up the encrypted files on his monitor, preparing to draft a counterstrike that would remind the board exactly why he held the gavel. The legal projections were grim. The hostile takeover bid from Hans Ion Dynamics was gaining traction, fueled by leaks from within his own inner circle. Every time he tried to plug a hole in his defense, 2 more appeared. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, the corporate predators at his door and the suffocating memory of the woman who should have been standing by his side. The air in the office felt thin, charged with the static of an impending storm. He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the empire pressing down on his shoulders, praying for a sign, a miracle, or even just a moment of peace. The world outside hummed with indifference, and for a heartbeat, Julian Kane felt smaller than he ever had in his life. Julian stared down at the small human occupying the space where his most sensitive documents usually lay, his breath hitching in his throat. The ruthless billionaire, whose very name made seasoned executives tremble, found himself paralyzed by a creature that didn't even reach his knee. He knew he should call security. He should demand to know how a toddler had bypassed a biometric-locked inner chamber. But as Julian leaned forward, intending to project the stern, untouchable authority that was his habit. The child did the one thing no one in this building dared to do: he reached out. "You shouldn't be here," Julian said, his voice intended to be a cold command but coming out as a shaky whisper. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle the boy, who was currently experimenting with the resistance of the heavy mahogany desk legs. The toddler, Leo, stopped his tugging and looked up. Instead of the fear Julian was used to seeing in the eyes of others, he found a pure, unfiltered curiosity. Leo let out a soft, bubbling coo and offered Julian a tiny, clenched fist. Julian's brow furrowed as he reflexively opened his hand. Leo dropped a crumpled, sticky piece of colorful candy wrapper into Julian's palm, a gift offered with the solemnity of a multi-billion-dollar merger. "Is this supposed to bribe me?" Julian asked dryly, a ghost of a smile twitching at the corner of his lips despite his best efforts to remain rigid. Leo's response was a wide, gummy grin, a familiar smile that felt like a jagged blade through Julian's carefully constructed defenses. It was the same effortless joy Elena used to radiate, a light Julian had convinced himself was gone from the world. When the boy reached out again, his tiny fingers grasping for Julian's silk tie, the billionaire didn't pull away. He felt the small weight of the child's hand against his chest, a warmth that was unwelcome yet undeniably steadying. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the boardroom betrayal and the anniversary of his loss felt distant. He was no longer a titan of industry under siege, he was just a man on a carpeted floor, captivated by a tiny, fearless intruder who didn't care about his net worth. As Leo patted Julian's shoulder and let out another delighted "Aoga," Julian realized his biometric locks were useless against a heart that had finally found a reason to beat again. The heavy silence of the office was shattered by the sound of the biometric doors sliding open with a frantic hiss. Julian's secretary, normally the personification of corporate composure, stood there breathless, but she was quickly eclipsed by a young woman in a faded service uniform who pushed past her. Her eyes were wide with a terror that Julian recognized instantly, the bone-deep fear of a parent who has lost sight of their world. "Leo," she gasped, her voice cracking as she saw the toddler still perched near Julian's expensive leather chair. She rushed forward, her boots clicking sharply against the marble floor, and scooped the boy into her arms, crushing him to her chest as if to shield him from the very air of the room. Julian stood slowly, his face resuming its mask of guarded authority, though the warmth of the child's hand still seemed to linger on his skin. "I assume you have an explanation for how he breached my private security," he said, his voice level but carrying the weight of a man accustomed to demanding answers. The woman, whose name tag read Sarah, didn't look up immediately. She was busy checking Leo's hands and face, her own tears blurring her vision. When she finally met Julian's gaze, she bowed her head deeply. "I am so sorry, Mr. Kane. I'm a night shift cleaner in the West Wing. My sitter cancelled at the last minute, and I couldn't lose this shift. I put him in the break room with his toys, I thought the door was latched. I didn't know he could." "You brought a child into a secure corporate facility because of a shift?" Julian cut in, his tone sharp. He intended to be ruthless, to protect the widower's wall he had spent years building, but then he saw her hands. They were raw, the skin chafed from harsh industrial chemicals, and they were trembling. He signaled his secretary to leave and closed the door. "Where is the boy's father, Sarah?" The question made her flinch. She tightened her grip on Leo, who was now reaching back toward Julian with a playful "Aoga." "He passed away 18 months ago, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the HVAC system. "A construction accident. There was no insurance, just debts. I worked the day shift at a laundry and the nights here just to keep the lights on." Julian felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the office temperature. He looked from the exhausted, grieving woman to the child with the familiar, haunting smile. She was a widow, fighting a war of survival alone in the shadows of his empire, while he sat in a penthouse mourning in luxury. The security breach was no longer a matter of biometrics, it was a mirror held up to his own isolated soul. The following week, the atmosphere in the executive suite felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. Julian sat at the head of the conference table, his silhouette framed by the looming digital displays of crashing stock projections and aggressive takeover headlines. Beside him, in a high chair that looked starkly out of place against the minimalist decor, Leo sat contentedly, gnawing on a teething ring. Julian had insisted the boy stay, ostensibly to vet Sarah's background, but in truth, the child's presence was the only thing keeping the billionaire's spiraling paranoia at bay. "Sir, we need to sign the Hans Ion merger agreement by midnight," his CFO pleaded, sliding a heavy, black leather folder toward him. "It's the only way to dilute the hostile shares and save your seat. The other options are dead ends." Julian looked at the folder, then at the digital ghosts of his board members on the screen, all of them wearing expressions of rehearsed concern. Every instinct he had, the cold, sharp instincts inherited from a legacy of survival, told him something was wrong, yet the data insisted this was the only path. Feeling a tug on his sleeve, Julian looked down. Leo had managed to wriggle his small arm out, pointing a chubby finger toward a discarded stack of blue folders at the far end of the table, files Julian had dismissed hours ago as minor administrative noise. "Nah." Leo chirped, slamming his tiny palm down on the table and splashing a few drops of apple juice onto the blue stack. The room went silent. The CFO cleared his throat. "Mr. Kane, that's just the audit trail for the mid-level logistics contracts. It's irrelevant to the takeover." Julian ignored him, his gaze fixed on Leo. The boy wasn't looking at the toys Sarah had brought, he was staring at the blue folder with a strange, focused intensity, his familiar smile replaced by a look of serious contemplation. It was the exact look Elena used to give him when she sensed a lie he had missed. "Bring me the blue folder," Julian ordered, his voice cutting through the CFO's protests like a blade. "Sir, we're out of time." "I said, bring it to me," Julian repeated, his eyes never leaving Leo's. As he pulled the folder toward him, the toddler clapped his hands twice in a sharp, rhythmic burst of approval. Julian opened the file, his eyes scanning the dry, technical columns of logistics data. There, buried in the subclauses of a minor shipping route, he saw it, a recurring payment to a shell company he hadn't authorized. A cold realization washed over him. The dead end the child had pointed to was actually the first thread of a massive, internal embezzlement scheme. The boardroom predators weren't just trying to take his company, they were already gutting it from the inside. Julian leaned back, a dark, predatory fire igniting in his eyes, as he realized that the smallest person in the room had just handed him the weapon he needed to destroy his enemies. The blue folder sat on the mahogany desk like an unexploded secondary device. Julian worked with a frantic, cold precision, his eyes darting between the logistics audit and his private server's financial logs. Leo had fallen asleep in his high chair, his small head tilted to the side, oblivious to the fact that his sticky-fingered curiosity had just handed Julian the thread that would unravel a conspiracy. As Julian dug deeper into the shell company payments Leo had highlighted, the Plan B merger contract, the very document his CFO had begged him to sign, began to transform before his eyes. On the surface, it looked like a lifeline, a complex stock swap that would dilute the hostile shares and protect Julian's chairmanship. But as he cross-referenced the blue folder's shipping manifests with the merger's hidden liability clauses, the trap snapped shut in his mind. The merger wasn't designed to save Kane International, it was designed to hollow it out. The shell companies were conduits for billions in debt that would be transferred to Julian's personal accounts the moment the ink was dry. By signing Plan B, he wouldn't be saving his wife's legacy, he would be assuming total legal and financial responsibility for a bankruptcy that had already been prearranged by his inner circle. His loyal advisors had built a golden parachute for themselves using his own grief as the fabric. They didn't just want the chair, Julian whispered, the realization chilling his blood. They wanted me in a cell. He looked over at the sleeping toddler. The familiar smile was gone in sleep, replaced by a peaceful, rhythmic breathing that seemed to mock the chaos of the room. Julian felt a surge of protective fury, not just for his company, but for the world this child had to grow up in. For 5 years, Julian had feared everyone, retreating behind his walls and playing into the hands of the predators. He had assumed that everyone was an enemy, which had blinded him to the actual traitor standing right next to him. With a few keystrokes, Julian initiated a silent, deep system sweep of his CFO's private communications. The screen flickered, then began to scroll through encrypted messages with Hans' ion dynamics. The proof was absolute. The security paradox he had worried about with Leo was nothing compared to the breach of trust sitting in his boardroom. He leaned back, his face a mask of stone-cold resolve. The board expected a broken widower to walk into the meeting tomorrow to sign his own death warrant. Instead, thanks to a toddler who liked blue folders, they were going to meet a man who had finally found a reason to fight back. He reached out and gently moved a stray curl from Leo's forehead, his hand no longer trembling. The wall of grief was still there, but for the first time, it wasn't a prison, it was a fortification. The boardroom was a tomb of glass and cold ambition as Julian Kane walked in, his footsteps echoing with a finality that made the air turn brittle. At his side, Sarah held Leo, the toddler's presence a jarring splash of color against the monochromatic sea of gray suits. The directors exchanged puzzled, condescending glances, but Julian didn't offer them the luxury of an explanation. He sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of granite, and placed the blue folder directly in front of his CFO. "The Hans-Ion merger is dead," Julian announced, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the table. The CFO let out a nervous, forced laugh. "Julian, you're emotional. The anniversary has clouded your judgment. Without this deal, you're finished." "I'm not finished," Julian said, leaning forward until he was inches from the man's face. "But your shell companies are. I have the audit trails, the logistics leaks, and the encrypted messages you sent while you thought I was too broken to notice." He watched the color drain from the man's face, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor. One by one, the other conspirators looked away, their bravado collapsing under the weight of the evidence. The security team entered the room, the click of their shoes signaling the end of an era. The directors waited for the explosion, for the ruthless lion to tear them apart with lawsuits and public ruin that would haunt their families for generations. That was the Julian they knew, a man who answered betrayal with total annihilation. But then, Julian felt a small, warm hand tugging at his jacket. He looked down to see Leo watching him, his eyes wide and innocent, free of the malice that filled the rest of the room. The familiar smile flashed briefly, a reminder that the world didn't have to be a battlefield of ghosts. Julian looked back at the men who had tried to bury him. "I could strip you of everything," Julian said, his voice quiet now, carrying a weight far heavier than anger. "I could ensure your children never see a dime of the legacy you tried to steal from mine. But there is a child in this room who hasn't learned to hate yet, and for his sake, I will not be the monster you expect." He pushed a set of resignation papers across the table. "Sign these. Forfeit your bonuses and your shares to the company's new employee relief fund. If you do, I'll let you walk out of here with your names intact. You'll be gone, forgotten, but your families will not pay for your sins." The room remained silent as the traitors scrambled to sign, their hands trembling with the shock of a mercy they didn't deserve. As they filed out like shadows, Julian didn't feel the hollow victory of a conquest. He felt a strange, light warmth. He reached out and took Leo from Sarah's arms, the boy's small weight anchoring him to the present. The widower's wall hadn't just been breached, it had been dismantled, replaced by a strength that no longer needed to hide behind steel and stone. The victory in the boardroom had felt like a surge of adrenaline, but as the sun dipped below the skyline, Julian felt a different kind of pull, one that led him away from the polished glass of his tower and into a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. He insisted on driving Sarah and Leo home himself, much to Sarah's quiet protest. As his sleek, black sedan navigated the narrow, potholed streets of the outskirts, the contrast between his world and hers became a physical ache. They pulled up to a gray, crumbling apartment complex where the scent of damp concrete and exhaust hung heavy in the air. The elevator was out of order, forcing them to climb 4 flights of stairs illuminated by flickering, yellowed lights. Julian carried Leo, the boy's head resting trustingly on his shoulder, while Sarah led the way, her posture stiff with a defensive pride that broke Julian's heart. When she opened the door to her unit, Julian froze. The apartment was spotlessly clean, a testament to Sarah's relentless effort, but it couldn't hide the structural decay. A single space heater hummed in the corner, struggling against the draft whistling through cracked window panes. In the kitchen, a stack of canned goods was meticulously organized, provisions for a life lived on the edge of a knife. There was no jasmine here, only the cold smell of survival. "It's not much," Sarah whispered, reaching out to take Leo from him. "But it's ours. We're safe here." Julian looked at the ceiling, where a water stain bloomed like a dark bruise, then down at Leo, who was pointing at a small, plastic toy on the floor with his familiar smile. The thought of this child, the child who had navigated a biometric fortress and saved a billion-dollar legacy, sleeping in a room where the heat might fail at any moment was intolerable. It wasn't just about charity, it was about justice. "No," Julian said softly, his voice echoing in the small space. Sarah turned, her eyes wide. "Mr. Kane, I didn't ask for." "I know you didn't," Julian interrupted, stepping closer. He looked around the room, seeing not just the poverty, but the immense strength it took for her to keep Leo's spirit so bright in such a dark place. "But Leo didn't just crawl under my desk, Sarah. He crawled into a life that was as cold and empty as this building. He saved me from a bankruptcy of the soul." He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights in the distance, his mind already moving with the decisive speed that had built his empire. "You are more than an employee, and he is more than a visitor. I cannot go back to that penthouse and sit in silence while the 2 people who brought me back to life are fighting just to stay warm." He turned back to her, his gaze steady and filled with a new, protective light. "Pack what matters. You're leaving this place tonight." The transition from the crumbling apartment to the sprawling Kane estate was made in a silence thick with unspoken shifts in gravity. As the iron gates hummed shut behind them, sealing out the cold city, Julian felt a strange, grounding peace settle over him. He led Sarah and a sleepy Leo through the vaulted grand foyer, his footsteps no longer sounding like the lonely echoes of a ghost in a museum. He stopped at the entrance to the West Wing, a sun-drenched annex that had remained shuttered since Elena's passing. "This will be your space," Julian said, his voice echoing softly against the silk-papered walls. "It has its own kitchen, a nursery that was, well, it's ready for use, and a direct line to the estate security." Sarah stood in the center of the room, her small suitcase looking painfully out of place against the hand-woven rugs. She looked at the plush furniture and the fireplace already crackling with warmth, then back at Julian with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "Mr. Kane, this is too much. I can't possibly." "It's a matter of security, Sarah," Julian interrupted quickly, his tone regaining a hint of its boardroom steel to mask the vulnerability underneath. "The men I removed from the board are desperate. They know you were the one who helped me find the audit trail. Until the legal proceedings are finalized, I cannot have you or Leo exposed in that apartment." It was a logical lie, a billionaire's shield. He told himself it was about safety protocols and corporate liability, but as he watched Leo crawl toward a soft velvet ottoman and let out a delighted squeal, Julian knew the truth. He was terrified of the silence that would return to his penthouse if they left. He was addicted to the familiar smile that had begun to bridge the gap between his past and his future. The thought of walking back into his office and not hearing a soft coo coming from beneath his desk felt like a second widowhood he wasn't prepared to endure. "I'll have the staff bring up dinner," he added, backing toward the door before his composure could slip further. "Rest. You've both earned it." As he walked back toward his private study, Julian didn't look at the portraits of his ancestors or the trophies of his wealth. He found himself listening, not for the buzz of his phone or the news of a stock crash, but for the distant, muffled sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls of his fortress. For the first time in 5 years, the widower's wall wasn't a barrier to keep people out, it was a sanctuary to keep the light in. He sat at his desk and realized he wasn't checking the global markets. He was simply waiting for tomorrow morning, dreading the minutes until he could see that smile again. 2 years had passed, yet the morning sun streaming through the auditorium windows felt as bright and transformative as that first night in the penthouse. Julian Kane sat in the front row, his posture still commanding, but the sharp, defensive edge of his shoulders had long since softened into a relaxed grace. He wasn't checking his watch or monitoring a fluctuating market, his focus was entirely on the small stage where a group of toddlers stood in somewhat chaotic formation. In the center of the stage stood Leo, wearing a tiny navy blazer that mirrored Julian's own. When the boy spotted Julian, his face lit up with that same, familiar smile, the one that had once been a ghostly reminder of a lost past, but was now the very foundation of Julian's present. Leo didn't hesitate, he broke formation and waved with both hands, shouting a delighted, "Dada," that echoed through the quiet room. A ripple of warm laughter moved through the audience. Julian didn't recoil or worry about his image. Instead, he felt a surge of pride so potent it made the memory of his widower's wall feel like a dream from another man's life. He glanced at Sarah, who sat beside him, her hand resting naturally in his. She looked elegant and radiant, the exhaustion of her double shift past replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She leaned in, whispering, "He's got your stubbornness, you know." Julian smiled, a genuine, deep-seated expression that reached his eyes. "And his mother's heart," he replied. When the ceremony ended, the principal stepped to the microphone. "We'd like to invite the parents of Leo Kane to the stage for a final photograph." Julian stood immediately, his heart tightening with a familiar, joyous expectation. As he walked toward the stage and felt Leo's small, sturdy weight jump into his arms, he realized that his world hadn't just been saved, it had been rebuilt. The billionaire who had once feared everyone had found his greatest security in the most vulnerable place. He looked at the camera, flanked by the woman who had shared his struggle and the boy who had crawled under his desk to find a heart that was waiting to be woken. As the camera flashed, Julian didn't see a titan of industry or a grieving widower. He saw a father. The biometric locks and high-security vaults of his old life were gone, replaced by a home where the doors were always open and the silence was forever broken by the sound of a familiar, happy laugh. The miracle that had arrived in the middle of his collapse had become his destiny, and as Julian held his family close, he knew that he had finally walked out of the shadows and into the light.